Again, just a little bit about the Wiener. It's a great honour to be here. Thanks very much for coming. This is actually a unique collection. Sorry to amplify what you said, but it's not only the Holocaust, it's actually a whole history of German Nazism, of Nazism. So because it was the person behind it, Wiener himself, he began collecting ephemera that you won't find anywhere else at all. Ephemera from the Nazi period, from the whole of the period of the Third Reich. So it is a remarkable place, and I'm always amazed that people haven't heard of it. I was interviewing the commentator journalist Afua Hirsch for the radio this morning, and she told me, I didn't realise, I'd never looked up her biography, but her grandfather and his younger brother were Kindertransport, though her grandfather's not quite classified as Kindertransport because he was a little bit older, but his younger brother was Kindertransport, and she hadn't heard of here. And I was saying to her, you know, come and research. It's not in any way speaking against Afua Hirsch, but it's just to spread the news. There are people who don't know of this incredible, unique archive, library, and as you can see, exhibition space. And there have been some incredible exhibitions here, one that overlapped with my field, children's literature, because they had a collection here, which I think you can still access online, of children's books and games in the Nazi period. And it is quite grotesque and extraordinary because they're very, I'm saying this in inverted commas, nice. They're gemütlich, you know, they're very nice toys and board games and so on, until you look at them closely and see that they are jam-packed full of Nazi ideology. So do come back, those of you who've never been here before, and of course those of you as well. So tonight I'm going to talk about a book I wrote called So They Call You Pisher. I'll just explain the title a bit. Pisher is a sort of rude word. It literally means a pisser in English, and it's a Yiddish word, pisher. But it doesn't really mean a pisser. It literally means a nobody, a nothing. And there are several words meaning a nobody or a nothing in Yiddish, like a nebish or a nisht. So Yiddish is full of mild imprecations, I could put it that way. Lots of words in order to sort of criticise somebody, which my father knew them all, I think. I think he'd sort of made a special collection. So at any given moment, I could be a knacker, a shmerel, a shlemiel, a yachna, a chaza, and I'll translate these as we go along. But so they call you Pisher. What can it possibly mean? Well, let me put it in context for you. So maybe you're going for a job, or maybe you're going for an interview, and then you say, well, maybe I won't go. No, I don't want to go for the interview. And my father would say, so they call you Pisher. And what that means is, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? They could call you a pisher. So it means sticks and stones will break my bones. You know, is that right? Yeah, that's right. Words will never harm me. So he said, what's the worst? So I remember my mother going for an interview at Goldsmiths College for a job. She'd been a primary school teacher, went for a job, and then she said, no, I'm not going for the job. And he said, so they call you Pisher. In actual fact, I might as well begin here. My parents had different attitudes to Yiddish, and perhaps different attitudes to being Jewish. I don't know. But my father regularly went into sort of Yiddish monologues quietly to himself, or swearing of one sort or another. And so you might hear him at the table and you might suddenly hear, and Mum would say, don't say that. And we'd say, well, what did he say? What did he say? And she'd say, don't tell them. Don't tell them. So I had to wait for my mum to die to find out many of the swear words and expressions that my father used. So, you know, I waited. You know, I was discreet about it. You know, I didn't do it. It wasn't straight away. You know, it was about 30 years later. And I said, do you remember that one you used to say that sounded a bit like... And he'd say, yes, I know that one. And then he'd translate it for me, and I won't be repeating it. Yeah. So this book is really, it's a story about the first 23 years of my life, if you like. I was brought up in the London suburbs. I was brought up in Pinner, a very exciting place to be brought up. No, I can hear mockery. I was brought up in Pinner. But actually, the more I started to write about it, I realised that I had to write about something else. I had to write about what I've called the missing. Because growing up in Pinner was a long way away from where my parents had grown up. They'd grown up in the London's East End, in that square mile that had been the place of settlement for Jews, largely from the Pale of Settlement of Poland, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Romania. The people had come largely from there, from between 1860 to 1905, when there was the Aliens Act, and my parents regularly talked about this place, this time In fact, I started to call it the myth, because we never went to the East End. I'm not quite sure why, but we never actually went there, so I wasn't quite sure whether it still existed. Growing up, I was born in 1946. Was the East End still there? I don't know. I didn't know, you see. And so it was a myth in terms of a place, but also all these people that they referred to. So there were aunties and uncles who we hardly ever saw, or perhaps didn't ever see really. And people, so for example, if we didn't study hard enough, my mother might say, or my father might say, well, you'll end up like the Michelsons. Like we knew who the Michelsons were. And what was the matter with the Michelsons? They were so poor, there were bed bugs in their beds. What are bed bugs? And then apparently that was in the East End. So there was one thing was in the East End, was the Michelsons, who were so poor, and bed bugs. So, you know, this is like when you're a child, you start building up a picture of what things were. And my parents had slightly different, well, quite different backgrounds themselves. So my dad, he was actually born in America. So I always felt very proud about this when I was a child, especially as he'd been in the American Army, because my dad had never naturalised. More on that in a minute. So my dad was American, had been in the American Army. I used to wear his American Army clothes around the house. And he'd been born in America, and then at the age of 2.5, his mother and 3 of her 5 children, she returned to England. She had been born in England herself. And she travelled on the SS President Harding, coming back with these 3 children, and one of whom died almost immediately. And my dad's father, Morris, in America, got quite cross about that, and blamed my dad's mum, who's called Rose Rosen, yeah, I know, sometimes known as Rosie Rosen, and he never came. So he stayed in the States. So my dad never knew his father. And so he was brought up by his mum, who was also an invalid, had polio. And so basically, my father, his sister and his mother, they lived on charity, and the rest of the family. And most of the rest of the family lived in the house, which is behind the Royal London Hospital in Nelson Street, opposite the Shul. And it was a 2 up, 2 down, and there were 11 or 12 people in it. My dad could never quite remember. He used to sit there going, well, there was Ray, there was Lally, there was Hilda, there was Millie. Sometimes there was cousin Bernie. Was Bernie there? I don't know. And nobody knew. These monologues with the questions in, nobody could answer them, you see. So he would go like, and of course there was Boober and Zayda, but then Zayda died when I was 13. At what point, and my dad only had to mention his Boober, that's grandmother, for those of you who don't speak Yiddish, Zayda is grandfather. Well, he only had to mention his Boober, and my mum would go, oh, don't talk about your Boober. And we'd say, well, why not? We'd say, well, he was spoiled. Look at him. You can see he was spoiled. Don't remember. And if my dad at the tea table had ever said, you know this ice cream, he'd say, this ice cream, it could do with just a little bit, you would nice, those little nuts that you can put over the top? My mum would very dutifully go and get some ice. Those little bits of chocolate you can put on the ice cream? That would be very nice. And then mum would say, you know why you like this? Because of your Boober. And I'll tell you something, I'm not your Boober. We'd be sitting there going, no. So anyway, so he was brought up by his Boober and his Zayda, who he loved dearly, who was from Poland and didn't speak English all that well, as far as I can understand, because my dad had to translate the Daily Worker for him. Well, he didn't translate it as such, but read it to him very slowly while his Zayda churned it over. So that was sort of a little bit there. You've got a picture of my father. My mother lived up the road in Bethnal Green, which my father thought was an incredibly dangerous place, because mostly that's where the Goyim lived. Sorry about that word. It means non-Jews. It's not really, I don't really approve of it as a word, but anyway, the Goyim lived in Bethnal Green, and your mother lived there. As if like that mattered to us in any way, living in Pinner, like there were only 2 Jews in Pinner at the time, and that was us. Why would we care? Anyway, so he had to go and had to court my mother in Bethnal Green, and she lived in Globe Road. And part of the thing about my dad swearing and going like this, and her saying, don't say that. And when we'd say, why shouldn't he say it? Mum would say, because that's what my relatives, mishpucha in Yiddish, that's why the mishpucha used to do in the back room when they were playing gin rummy. Like we knew what gin rummy was. Why would we know what gin rummy was? Anyway, so this seemed to be the main reason why my mum disapproved of my dad swearing. My mum and dad's first date was the Battle of Cable Street. Some of you, if you don't know the Battle of Cable Street, there was a man called Oswald Mosley who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and he pretended he was not anti-Semitic. He would walk about saying, of course I don't hate Jews, even though most of his followers walked behind him shouting, "Perish Judah," which you'd have thought sort of meant, you'd have thought that had some kind of anti-Semitic content, I don't know. But anyway, in practical terms it meant he attacked Jews on the streets in the East End. He didn't personally, because he was too posh for that. So he had other people to do it, and then he had a plan that on October the 4th, 1936, his plan was to march through the East End. They were in uniform. The uniforms, the BUF, as they called themselves, was to march through Cable Street, which was probably something like a 90-95% Jewish area. And the news went out that this was going to happen, and as it happens, it was a day in which a demonstration had been called to support the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. So the left, led at that time by the Communist Party, were torn. Do we go to Trafalgar Square, or do we stay put here, not actually Cable Street, but Gardener's Corner, and try and stop Mosley? In the end, the decision was made to stop Mosley marching. And so what happened was there was a huge act of civil disobedience. It's not often called that, but somewhere between 100 and 250,000 people collected and also barricaded Cable Street. Now, the way my mum and dad told the story was a bit bizarre, because they said, Cable Street was one of our first, it was our first date. Not that we ever used that word date until about 1973, but anyway. So that was, and they say, and we were on the wrong side of the barricades. And as I didn't know what a barricade was, not many in Pinner, not many barricades in Pinner, so the idea of being on the wrong side, either physically or metaphorically, had no meaning for me at all, until Mum explained that what happened was that they'd been at the Gardener's Corner, then they walked round to Cable Street, if you know your geography, and they found themselves walking down an alley, and two mounted policemen were coming towards them, and the mounted policemen in those days, this is rather horrific, had been trained in India. Yes, to quell rebellions and uprisings in India, and carried with them what Americans call nightsticks. That's the long baton, not the short baton. And so they beat people from their horses. And Mum and Dad, they weren't actually my mum and dad at that moment, they were Connie Isakovsky and Harold Rosen. And they saw the Mounties coming towards them and thought, well, we're finished now, it's all over now. When a door opened and they were pulled inside and were saved at the Battle of Cable Street. So this was one of the kind of heroic stories from my childhood that my parents told. But the other heroic story, slightly more serious in a way, though it's slightly bizarre the way it took place, was that my mum told the whole history of the war at the kitchen table at tea time, when my dad went off to do something. I don't know quite what, but read a book usually. It did a lot of reading. And Mum moved the teacups round on the table and told the Battle of Stalingrad. And it's quite extraordinary, really, when I think back to it now. And she would say, Stalin was over here, and he got rid of the generals. Why did he get rid of the generals? We said, don't get rid of the generals. But Zhukov was there. So anyway, I learnt the Battle of Stalingrad. What was his name? Cheetham? Who was it who wrote the wonderful book about the Battle of Stalingrad? He didn't need to write it. He could have gone to see my mum. And she wasn't even there, So anyway, so she's moving it around. And I had a very strong sense from her that it was the Battle of Stalingrad that had saved them. Now, whether that's historically true or not, we can argue about, but their feeling was, and this relates to why they were in the Communist Party, why they stayed in the Communist Party until, and we'll come to that in a minute, that's the Battle of Stalingrad was the decisive battle of the Second World War, that if the Third Reich had invaded Britain, they would have been killed, certainly, they knew that much, that they would have been killed. And so in some way or another, it was the Battle of Stalingrad that saved them. And this was a very powerful reinforcement as to why they'd been members of the Communist Party. So that sense of the myth, which I'm talking about, was there as well. You get an idea there, if you like, of my parents and talking about it. But when we're talking about this thing of absence, and I've talked about, so there's a whole chunk of the family in America that my father would allude to. There were these other relatives around in the country somewhere, and I never quite knew where. Though once, at some phase in the embourgeoisement of my parents, we were in, of all places, John Lewis, of course. Where else? Where do you mark your embourgeoisement if it isn't John Lewis? And I remember I was with him, and I was about 16 or 17, and we were walking along, and then a tall woman, probably taller than my dad, walked towards us, and as she just got past, she went, "Harold!" And nobody spoke to my dad like that. I think he spoke a bit like that because he had been a head of English in a school, so I think he learnt how to speak like that. But anyway, this lady said, "Harold," and we both turned round, and then she said, because he didn't know, he just looked at her, he said, "It's your Auntie Raina." And I went, I'd never heard of anybody called Raina. I'd only heard of Ray, and I now assume it was the same person. And so they had a very brief, frosty conversation, and then off she went, you see. And I said, "Who was that?" "Oh, that was Ray. That was Ray." And I said, "Oh, right. Well, what does she do?" "Oh, I don't know. She's a Labour councillor in East Ham." "Was she? That's really interesting." "Oh, I don't know. Yeah, she married an Irish bloke called Collins, I think, named after Michael Collins, the revolution." I said, "That would have been amazing. Why don't we ever know?" No, I don't want to know the mashbucha." And that was it. So, most of them, apart from his sister Sylvia, I hardly ever knew. So there's one set of missing. There was also another missing, which was that there was a boy between me and my brother who died. And I've written a bit about that. It's a rather extraordinary, and I can't explain it, thing where once I was sitting with my father and my brother, and we were going through the old photographs, as you do, and you're pulling people out, and you're saying, "Who's that?" And you go, "I don't know, no idea, I think that's Zada's brother, but I can't be sure." And we're pulling out these little, and then there's a picture of my mum with a baby on her lap. And I said, "Oh, is that me or Brian?" That's my brother Brian. I said, "Is that me or Brian?" He looked at it and he said, "Well, no, it's not either of you. That's Alan, he died." We went, I was 11. So 11 years of my life, and I didn't know that there was a baby. There were no signs around the house, there were no pictures, there was nowhere to go, there was nothing at all. So, and he said, "Whooping cough." And it was during the war, and they didn't have the medicines. So I remember almost feeling ashamed that I'd asked, like when you're a kid and you ask something and it's sort of in an area that hasn't been spoken of, you sort of feel guilty that you've asked it, you know what I mean? And I remember my dad saying, "No, he's a lovely boy," you see, like that. Now, the very strange thing now is that my mother never ever mentioned it. And we never dared ask my mum about it. And my dad never said that he had told us about it. And my father, I don't know, I don't think he possibly ever mentioned it, except it did come up in a conversation when my own son died. I lost my son when he was 19 from meningitis. And we had a sort of little conversation about losing a kid, But it was a sort of another area of the missing and sort of another mystery about my parents. But the one that I thought I'd talk to you about in a minute was the fact that when we go through the photos, and every now and then my father would say, "But of course there were the French relatives and the Polish ones." And we'd go, "Well, who are they? Where are they?" You see, and there were no pictures. And he'd say, "Well, there were my father's uncles." My father's uncle, yeah, there was my father's uncles in France. They were there at the beginning of the war and they weren't there at the end. I go, "Why not?" "Oh, the camps." Because this is the 50s and the word Holocaust wasn't around, the word Shoah wasn't really around. People used to say the camps. It's quite an interesting sort of evolution as to how that happened. So the camps, what are the camps? And maybe I get a few words out of them about it. So there was that, and then there was a sort of string of Polish relatives that he wasn't sure of their names because it's on his father's side, and of course he's estranged from his father, so he doesn't quite know. But there was one, I think. Well, of course there was the Rechnicks who were the parents of Michael Rechnick, who turned up on Sylvia's doorstep. Right? Do you remember he was in a DP camp? He was in a DP camp. His parents had put him on a train in Belitz in western Poland when the Nazis arrived, and he never saw them again. And then he fought in the Polish Free Army. This is my dad just running it all together. He fought in Anders' army, Anders' Polish Free Army, all round the edge of Europe, up through Italy, fought at the Battle of Monte Cassino, chucked in a DP camp, didn't go back to Poland because all his relatives had gone, and he turned up, knocked on Sylvia's door. He must have had the address already. So he must have had the address, knocked on Sylvia's door and said, "Lady Sylvia." And he stayed. He's a taxi driver, lives in Stanmore. So what is he to you? He's my cousin. Why? His name's Rechnick. The mother, Stella, Bella, Stella, either, both. Anyway, Stella, that's the mother. That's my aunt. Oh, right, what happened to her? I don't know. The camps. Must have gone to a ghetto. The camp. I don't know. Boom, full stop. Yeah. So I had this other sense of the missing, that there was this area around. So I'll just go on to read you one little bit about what it was like with my friends at secondary school, and then I'm going to tell you what I did about the missing, if you like, all right? So this is me, aged about 13, 12, 13, and my best friend at school is a guy called Dave Stoller. Dave was my best friend at the time. He lived in Stanmore, and he used to ask me over for Friday nights, what my father called Shabbos Benacht, as if we observed the eve of the Jewish Sabbath. I'd never seen or done these Friday nights. At Dave's house there was Dave, his younger sister, his younger brother and his mum and dad. His mum was not a happy person and could turn every conversation into a comment about why she wasn't appreciated. His dad was a jazz musician who had given it all up to sell shoes in Wembley Market. "It's not all about you selling shoes, Morris," said Dave's mother. "What do you think I do all day?" When I arrived at the house, he said, "Lovely to see you, Michael. How's your auntie?" I said, "You don't know my auntie. That's why I asked," he said. When we sat down, he said, "If I didn't have a couple, I could put my hand over my head. God won't mind." "Why'd you say that, Morris? It makes it sound like I haven't got any spare. Just open the drawer and give the boy one." I put on a couple. Morris said the prayer, poured the wine into a silver cup and drank it. "Any of you men want some?" "For goodness sake, Morris. We were all communists once," Morris said, "but I could see it doesn't work. It's human nature." "You don't know what you're talking about, Morris. Do you like jazz, Michael?" "I don't know," I said. "Music's the most important thing in the world," he said. "I could spend all day playing jazz." "I know," said Dave's mum, "and you would if it wasn't for me." "What size are you?" Morris said. "8. 8 already? What are you, a monster?" He went out the room and came back with a box. It was a pair of corduroy slippers. "Do you wear slippers?" he said. "No," I said. "Then sell them." "I know a very good place in Wembley Market. It's run by a good man called Morris. Reminds me, a very old friend of mine was dying. He called for his sons to come to his bedside. 'Harvey, here, Dad. Monty, here, Dad. Solly, here, Dad.' And my friend said, 'So who's minding the shop?' Dave's mum said, 'Why'd you do that, Morris? Michael doesn't know whether that's true or not.' It wasn't his friend, Michael. Yeah, it wasn't his friend, it was a joke. I thought, it's a joke? What's the joke? The bloke wants to know who's minding the shop. If you had a shop, you'd want to know that someone was minding it, wouldn't you? Do you know, Michael, the other day a fella come into the shop and he says, 'What is it with you, Morris? Why are you always asking questions? Is that a Jewish thing?' And I said to him, 'Why'd you ask?' Dave and his brother and sister groaned. Morris got out his guitar. It was a light brown, very shiny semi-acoustic. He plugged it in. 'Turn that down, Morris. I can't hear a thing.' He whispered to me, 'Why does she need to hear a thing? What is this thing she needs to hear? All my life she says, turn it down, Morris. I can't hear a thing. And I've never found out what the thing is she can't hear.' He was vamping along as he talked, soft jazz chords, and Dave started playing the piano. It all sounded so clever. I'd never sat in a room with musicians like them. Morris and Dave just played and played without ever looking at a piece of music. It flowed out of them. Then I went upstairs to Dave's room and he had a record player. He said, 'This is the most amazing record that's ever been made.' He put it on and it was Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. The day after Charlie Parker died, he said, all over New York, people wrote up on the walls, 'Bird lives.' Morris came in and asked me why I wasn't having a bar mitzvah. I said it was because we didn't believe in God. And Morris said, 'What's believing in God got to do with it?' 'Your father had a bar mitzvah. He didn't.' 'He didn't? What are you talking about? I was there. Were you?' 'No, I was lying.' 'His mother didn't agree with bar mitzvahs,' I said. 'He told me.' 'So how did he get his first suit?' 'He says his Zayda made it.' 'That's clever.' You're not fools in your family, are you? Do you know what a schmendrick is? No, it's a fool. Your father's no schmendrick. Dave had to learn speeches for the bar mitzvah. It involved reading pages of Hebrew. The books lay open in his bedroom. 'Do you think there'll ever be socialism?' Morris said. 'Yes,' I said. 'You're wrong,' he said. 'I see these people come into Wembley Market, they come in my shop and I think, how can there be socialism when the world's full of schmucks?' 'That's awful,' I said. 'You can't think like that.' 'I try not to,' he said. 'Believe me, I do. I'm just saying what I think. We have to say what we think. Don't you agree, Michael?' 'Oh, why do you talk such rubbish, Dad?' Dave said. 'Do you think I talk rubbish, Michael?' I said, 'No.' 'Then you're the first person in the world to think that.' 'Let me shake your hand,' he said. And Dave's mum put her head round the door and said, 'Don't leave your teacup there, Morris. I spent hours tidying up the last mess you left.' So look, there's a little picture of sort of how it was there. And in actual fact, I was just saying to Mike there that I was standing in the Arsenal shop, as you do, probably most of you. I was standing in the Arsenal shop buying some kit gear for my son, for my youngest son, and there's a man standing next to me, and he said, just straight out of the blue, "Did your father ever get the bar mitzvah suit?" And he was a young guy, he was in his 20s, I think. And I said, "Sorry, who are you?" He said, "Oh, well, my name's," I think he said it was Collins, actually, so I don't. Anyway, he said, "Yeah, I think I'm your third cousin once removed." And the thing is, my great-grandfather was supposed to make your dad a suit for the bar mitzvah, but when your dad's mum said that he wasn't going to have a bar mitzvah, my great-granddad said he wasn't prepared to make the suit, all right? And so, did he get the suit? I said, "Yeah, no, it's all right. His Zayda made the suit, but he couldn't do the lapels." So he must have got someone else to do it. So there we are. These things all connect up. And now then, so of a slightly different order, and I'll just tell this little story because some of it owes its existence to this wonderful place. So I've got this idea in my head, yes, of the French relatives. And if any of you know the history of France during the Second World War, all right, so the Germans invaded France. France was split into two, so it was a diagonal. You had what was called Free France, or well, it wasn't really called Free France, but the Zone Libre, which was Vichy, as we now call it, and it's the slang word for it because the headquarters of the regime that ruled there was in Vichy, where the water comes from, and then the other half was occupied. And then after a period of time, Germany occupied what people always say is the whole of France, but no, as we shall see. So the story is told, obviously, there were about 300,000 Jews in France at the beginning of the war, and about 78,000 of them were deported. Why there's 78,000, we shall come to. So all I knew of these relatives in France were two names, Oscar and Martin. And a big document came out thanks to the work of the Klaasvelds, Serge Klaasveld and his wife, who've just been honoured by the French government, who put together a huge document of all 78,000 names. So they pieced together the names and so on. And I've managed to pick up this document from a second-hand bookseller in Stoke Newington, would you believe, by the name of Philip, who said, "Oh, you might be interested in that." And it was sitting on the floor. And I looked at it and I said, "Yes, La Déportation des Juifs," and all the rest of it. And I said, "Oh, I'll have that." And I went through it and put little rings around every Rosen. And of course, Rosen is actually quite a common name, common Jewish name. So there were about 40 of them, which didn't really help me narrow it down because there was no Oscar Rosen. There were quite a few Martins, most of whom seemed to spell their name with a Z, whereas as you know, I spell my name with an S. So I didn't really get very far with that, but I had this document, this great big document, produced by Serge Klaasveld. And he himself came from a family, some of whom were deported from Nice. In France. So that's all I had. And then I thought I'd pick up the trail of the rest of the family. It annoyed me that my father had gone to America, he'd been in the American army, but he hadn't bothered much with the American half of the family. So I went and met up with his cousin Ted and those relatives over there, and I started quizzing them, as you do when you want to find out this stuff. And there was my father's cousin Olga as well. And she said how they'd written before the war to these French relatives, and everybody sat there saying yes, and then they disappeared and we never saw them again. And there was Oscar and Martin, and I wrote to them, and I think they reeled off a set of towns on the eastern side of France, Nancy, Metz, Strasbourg, and so on, and said that they were there and there was a road, the Rue de Thionville. And she said, Olga said, I used to write to them because I wanted to practice my French. I thought, I've got a little link. I've got a little lead here. Maybe I could find them. And I was once sitting in an airport, as you do, and there was a bloke there, and I started speaking to him in French, because I like speaking French. And he said he came from Metz, and I said, is there Rue de Thionville? Yes, he said. I said, oh, incredible, told him the story. And he said, I'll look it all up for you, and I'll write to you. So I thought, well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. And he said, you look it all up at the mairie, that's the town hall where you have a whole list of names. I thought, I'm onto this. And he did write back a couple of months' time and said, there is no Rosen at all in the Rue de Thionville in Metz. And I thought, right, that's it, I'm finished, no go, end of story. Then a few years went by, Ted's son, Teddy, we'll call him Ted Jr., all right, he suddenly writes to me, and this is an extraordinary moment, the kind of thing that you just can't believe, and his mother's brother long after his mother had died, and now he's died as well, and in his papers are found 4 letters, and they come from, 2 of them come from France, and 2 of them come from Poland. And the 2 from France come from Oscar, and the 2 from Poland come from this chap, the one who lives in Stanmore, his parents. And the 2 from France are asking for help, and the 2 from Poland are asking for help, 1940-41, the letters. And of course I'm then looking at the ones in particular. I straight away sent all the letters to Michael Rechnik, my father's cousin, but in the meantime I looked at these 2 from France, and there was an address on them, 11 Rue Mélèze, 11 Rue Mélèze in Niort in southwestern France. And I'm thinking, how does this fit? How does this fit? Well, what happened, I'll try and keep the story short enough, so that when the Nazis came into France, on the eastern side of France, there was what the French call the Exodus. That's l'exode in French. Virtually the whole of eastern France migrated westwards, and there were already places that they had prepared for where they could live. Remember, the French were rather ill prepared for the Nazi invasion because they had built what they thought was an impregnable line, not expecting the Nazis to realise that the line didn't actually include Belgium. So tragically and awfully, but in its own way comically, I concede, the Nazis went, oh, well, let's go over the top then. So they didn't bother with the Maginot Line, as it was called, which was this incredible emplacement of arms and soldiers and all the rest of it. They zoomed in over the top. So they went in over the top through Belgium, invaded France, and straight away millions, perhaps 2 or 3 million French people migrated westwards. So clearly Oscar Rosen migrated into Niort in southwest France. So now I've got an address. I immediately went online, I did the street search, and would you believe there was 11 Rue Mélèze, exactly as it was, an old French shop front and a little flat over the top. And I thought, well, can I find out anything more? So then I Googled and found a book called Les Chemins de la Honte, The Paths of Shame, the story of the persecution of Jews of Deux-Sèvres. This is the département of France where Niort is. And I remember it arriving in the house on the day we were moving. It somehow seemed sort of quite significant because obviously I was supposed to help. You know, like that thing where you're supposed to kind of contribute. But the book came literally as the Pantechnicon arrived, and I'm whipping it open, and I did that thing that I confess that I quite often do with the book, is I look in the back to see if my name's in it. All right, sorry, it's egotism, I know, but on this occasion, rather more tragically, and I looked in the back and saw the name Rosen, and there were about 20 references. So I went to the first, flicked it open, and what did it say? Rosen, 11 Rue Mélèze. And the list of names was what the French call fichier juif. That's to say, a Jewish document. And this was the document, you may not know about France, is you have a central government, very strong local government, and between the two you have what's called the préfecture, the prefecture. We don't have it in this country. And the préfet and the sous-préfet, the prefect and the sub-prefect, had compiled lists of foreign-born Jews for the Nazis. And what they did was make a list of every Jew in France who had not been born in France, and handed these lists over to the Nazis. And either in conjunction with them or off their own bat, and some of that is disputed, they then started to put the Jews in camps, these foreign-born Jews, some in camps, in so-called transit camps. Others they registered, and then bit by bit they put the yellow star on them, l'étoile jaune, which was marked juif, and also, and this is incredible, Aryanized their possessions. That's the phrase that the French Vichy government used, Aryanisé. So they Aryanized all their possessions, in other words, seized them, and in some way or another made them not Jewish, made them Aryan, however you want to pronounce it. And then if they had some kind of business, or usually if everything's taken away from them, they became market stall holders or whatever, and they had to put on their market stall entreprise juive, that's to say, or jüdische Geschäft, that is Jewish business. And they had to put that sign up. So I noticed that, and I was following this story through, while in actual fact, you know, Emma was saying to me, Michael, the bags, and I'm going, entreprise juive. So there was a slightly sort of thing, and I was desperate. I'd never seen this stuff, and here is one problem, it doesn't say Oscar Rosen. It says Yeshe Rosen. Yeshe? Yeshe, is that? Oh, is it the same guy? It must be the same guy. And he's apparently married to someone called Rachel, which I didn't know. So anyway, so I think it's just possibly not the same one, but wait. So then I've got this, and then it says that this Oscar Rosen was on Convoy 62. He had died, he'd gone on Convoy 62, this Yeshe Rosen. So they're not Oscar. So then I went back to my Klaasveld, and sure enough, Convoy 62, there's Yeshe Rosen, and he's born in Oswiecim. He's born in Auschwitz. That's where he was born. And I remember thinking at that moment, I saw that, and I thought, my God, this guy, if it really is my father's uncle, I'm just hanging on, just there's still a bit of if about it. So he was born in Auschwitz, and then somehow or other he's landed up being deported, and it says the story of the train, left Paris-Bobigny, I don't know whether if you know Paris, and took 3 days to get to Auschwitz. Several people escaped, but he arrived, and then it's got the numbers of people who were gassed immediately, numbers who were put in on a detail. You can look it up online, and there is Yeshe Rosen and Rachel, who's listed her name as Hesler. And there, I thought, well, now I've got that far, but then how did they get from Niort? And it doesn't say, it says in the book that they had escaped. They had become clandestins in French. They had become secret, clandestine. So what happened? I went on Googling, and suddenly, weirdly and extraordinarily, up popped online a photograph of what is in French called une stèle, that's to say a stone, a memorial stone, in the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Sedan, in northeastern France, and on it says, Oscar and Rachel Rosen, victims of Nazi barbarism, in a cemetery in Sedan. So, is this Oscar? Is it Yeshe? Is it the same person? How extraordinary. I wrote to the person who was writing up the stories. I found again another name online. About, well, is this the same person? Is it Oscar? Where did you find out? And he said, oh, well, yes, Oscar Rosen, I found in the documentation, was arrested in Nice. So now I've got a triangle. If you know your France is like a square. We've got Sedan up the top there. We've got Niort over here. And we've got Nice down the bottom. Googling some more. Nice was not occupied by the Germans, was not occupied by the Nazis, it was occupied by the Italians. Provence and Nice were occupied by the Italians. The Nazis demanded that the Italians hand over the Jews of Nice in the same way as Vichy was handing over, to start off with, the foreign-born Jews in France. And the Italians refused. Nobody knows exactly why. There's a joke about Mussolini having a Jewish mistress. I have no idea whether that is true or whether that would be a sufficient motive to save the Jews of Nice, just to be ridiculous about it, but that was the story. But clearly the rumour, the story went round France, if you want to be saved, get to Nice. So somehow or other, and it's a good 300 miles, I think, from Niort to Nice, my father's uncle and aunt had managed to get, they'd given up all their property, so whether they walked it, I've no idea. How did they do it? Got from Niort to Nice. What was going on in Nice was that the Jews were sitting there in hotels, and this was the bit that the Wiener Library was able to help me with. The Jews were sitting in the hotels because a Jewish Italian guy called Donati was requisitioning boats and falsifying passports to get the Jews out of Nice to North Africa, which you'll all remember had been liberated by Monty at the Battle of El Alamein, and so he had requisitioned 4 boats. But at this very moment, the Italians were being defeated by the Allies, by America and Britain. So Donati realised this. He rang Eisenhower, or telegrammed him, and said, please don't announce the armistice, give me a week to get them out. And Eisenhower refused, or disagreed, or whatever, and announced the armistice on the Saturday. And on the Monday and the Tuesday, the Nazis marched in to Nice and Provence. The Jews are waiting in the hotels, and the person who marched in was Eichmann's right-hand man, an absolute vicious Momser, you can translate Momser for yourself, all right, called Alois Brunner, all right, who ended his life totally safely, going to sleep in his own bed in Syria. Alois Brunner who was a violent, nasty, sadistic person anyway. I mean, it wouldn't make any difference if he was nice, but you know what I mean. Okay, and he rounded up, it was no difficulty, they were in the hotels. Okay, and he rounded them up and then deported them north to Drancy, which is the main transit camp for the deportation of Jews from France, which was, ironically, a beautiful modernist housing estate designed by Le Corbusier, still there. So Drancy became a sort of internment camp for the roundups, les rafles, as they say in French. Les rafles de Veldiv is the famous one. They were rounded up and put on trains, and so that's what happened. So Oscar, or Yeshe, is it both, is it either? I don't, still not 100%, I sorted it out, don't worry. So they go on the train to Auschwitz, so I've now solved all that. I went on Googling randomly, just wondering whether I could ever solve this Oscar Yeshe thing. Up pops, on an American website, Olga Rosen, cousin of my dad, who I sat with and talked in America, had applied for immigration status to America in February 1939 for Yeshe Rosen. It's the first time I connected Yeshe to Oscar and Oscar to Yeshe. She had applied. I wrote to the immigration authorities and said, was it turned down or was it accepted? They said, well, we assume if the person hadn't come, it was turned down, but we don't know. So I had sat with Olga, and she had said, he was called Oscar, never mentioned he was called Yeshe, said that she stopped writing to him when she had only been written to him when he was a kid, and she hadn't said she had ever applied for the migration to get him to America, him and his wife. Ask me why? I don't fully know. Now reel forward to me writing this book. So I'm writing the book, I'm writing all this in the book, and I suddenly get a note from Teddy Jr. Do you remember Ted Jr., who I'd spoken to in America, who had sent me those 4 letters, which I've put in the book, by the way. And he says, well, Ted's died, aged 103, and his mother has died, his stepmother, I should say, has died in her 90s, so he'd gone into the house, and there's a locked closet, and I know where the locked closet was, because I sat in front of it with Ted, and at one point Olga, yeah? There's a locked closet. He said, we opened the closet, and inside the closet was a box that was sealed, and it said family photos on it. And he opened up the box, and inside it were photos of Yeshe, Rachel, his wife, Martin, their parents, in other words, my father's great-grandparents, and a whole set of family photographs as I'm proofreading the book. And I thought, well, I'll never see those photos. I'll never know what they looked like. But even more emotional, if you like, there was one picture of 2 women and a boy. And the boy, above the boy, it says Mordke, or Mishka, one or the other, I've forgotten for the moment, sorry. And then it says Stella and Bella. So Stella is Michael Rechnick's mum, the one taxi driver in Stanmore, and his sister, and the mother's, Stella's sister, Bella. They're walking arm in arm, and Michael, as we call him in England, is there as well as a young man. And I thought, my goodness, that's a photograph he would never even know perhaps even existed. All right, so the photograph is taken in Poland, in what the Germans used to be called Bielitz, is now called Bielski Biala, and I sent it digitally to Michael's son, and he came back and said, well, Michael was mesmerised. He's only got one picture of his mother, right? No pictures of his father, as far as I know, but certainly only one picture of his mother that he kept with him all the time that he had travelled, been in the Anders army, and all this time now in his 90s, he's kept it. He had never seen that picture before, and so there, out of that closet, came this picture, and I've put it in the book along with a picture of Yeshe. I just thought that's so extraordinary that had survived, but I'd sat in front of it with Ted, and he had gone, well, we don't know what happened to them. They died in the camps. I don't know. And he just sort of stared at the ground. And so my trip into the missing, in a sense, I'd solved virtually kind of as much as I thought I'd ever do. I wrote in the hardback that he's in a uniform, and I just idly assumed it was a French uniform. So I put Yeshe in his French army uniform. And then something, I don't know what it was, made me wonder perhaps it wasn't. And I put it up on Twitter, and I'm friends with Helen Weinstein in Oxford, who's the professor of history and public knowledge about history. And she got in touch with people who know all about army uniforms in the First World War, and it turned out that his uniform was in fact a Polish brigade of the Austro-Hungarian army. And when I looked up the history of that Polish brigade, Yeshe fought in about 35 battles in the First World War alongside the German army. And I just thought, well, even that wasn't good enough, was it? I'll finish there. And if we can have questions, anybody would like to ask me anything at all about any part of that, whether it's the central bit of me in the suburbs, or the myth before, or the missing, please feel absolutely free. Okay, is that okay? Yes?